The man known to history as Gregor Strasser was born on the 31st of May 1892 in the small town of Geisenfeld in Bavaria, in the southern part of the German Empire. His father was Peter Strasser, a member of a farming family from Upper Bavaria. Peter broke with a long-standing family tradition of agricultural work and became a bureaucrat instead, working for the House of Wittelsbach, the ruling family of the Duchy of Bavaria and the subsequent Kingdom of Bavaria since medieval times. The Wittelsbachs had retained their positions as kings of Bavaria, even after the unification of Germany and the emergence of the German Empire in 1871, though in a much more ceremonial capacity than when they had actually controlled the independent Bavarian state. Peter Strasser eventually rose to become a chancellery advisor at the courthouses of Windsheim and Deggendorf in Bavaria. Gregor's mother was Paulina Strasser, née Strobel, the daughter of a middle-class couple, her father being a museum warden in Dinkelsbühl. She and Peter had married in August 1891, and Gregor was the eldest of their 5 children. Paulina gave birth to 3 boys and 1 girl after Gregor: Paul in 1895, Otto in 1897, Olga, and finally Anton. Otto became as politically active as Gregor in the 1920s, thus intertwining the 2 brothers' stories far beyond their childhood. Growing up in Bavaria in the 1890s and 1900s, life was uneventful for Gregor. He attended Windsheim Primary School in Franconia, before attending Gymnasia in Traunstein and Burghausen. His family was staunchly Catholic, and much of his education was overseen by Jesuits in a part of Germany which had retained its allegiances to Rome throughout the Protestant Reformation and thereafter, unlike the vast majority of northern Germany. Gregor's family life was formative. Peter Strasser was a politically conscious individual, and in 1912 published a work entitled The New Way, in which he tried to amalgamate elements of socialism, Christianity, and nationalism into a cohesive whole. He was a supporter of the imperial government and tried to inculcate in his sons the benefits of a form of conservative socialism, political views which would significantly shape both Gregor and Otto's political outlook in years to come, a fact which was clearly acknowledged by Gregor himself years later when he published a collection of his speeches and dedicated the book to his father. Gregor came of age in a period of immense social and political change in Germany. The German Empire had only recently been established in 1871, following a series of wars in which Prussia had united the 30 or so smaller German states under its rule after centuries of Germany being divided into scores or even hundreds of small states, principalities, and independent cities. Following the unification of the country, it quickly emerged as one of the most powerful countries in the world, buoyed by its industrial growth in the 19th century and growing economic strength. As a result, Germany was able to begin demonstrating its strength as a great power. This was most pronounced in 2 major conferences to decide on a wide range of issues amongst the European powers at this time, had been held in Berlin in 1878 and 1884 rather than in London, a sign of the shifting political landscape of the continent. By the time Gregor was born in 1892, Germany was also emerging as a colonial power, acquiring colonies in East Africa, Southwest Africa, and in the Western Pacific. One other notable development within German society at this time was the emergence of the Folkish movement, one which looked back to Germany's past to foster a sense of the German people being a great race that ought to play a major role in world affairs. Although the Folkish movement was a subculture in the 1890s and 1900s, it would become more prominent across Germany years later and would significantly shape Gregor's life and own political outlook. While these developments were playing out in the wider country, young Gregor was embarking on a career in the medical sector. He wanted to become a doctor, but his parents, as middle class as they might have aspired to be, did not have sufficient resources to send Gregor to medical school for many years, while also supporting 4 other children. Therefore, Gregor had to take the decision in his late teenage years to abandon his desire to become a doctor and instead become a chemist or pharmacist, a career option which would require far fewer years of study. He began serving an apprenticeship in Frontenhausen in 1910 after he turned 18, paying his own way for much of his studies by writing for a local newspaper. After 3 years, he completed his initial training and then headed for Munich, the capital of Bavaria, to study at the university there in 1913. His studies as a pharmacist would ultimately be interrupted by the outbreak of the First World War late the following summer, though he would return to them years later and become a trained pharmacist. Nevertheless, his experiences in the late 1900s and early 1910s left a lasting impression, and in the 1920s, he regularly expressed the view that the German educational system was poorly run and failed to aid students from less affluent families in achieving their goals. While Gregor was in his training as a pharmacist, Germany was hurtling towards war. In the course of the 1900s, the rise of Germany as a major power was leading to increased tensions across the continent. A naval race to see which country could build the most destroyer-class battleships, the foremost and most powerful battleship of the early 20th century, had developed between Britain and Germany. A web of complex alliances had also emerged, though 2 primary alliances began to become the most important. One was led by Germany and the Empire of Austria-Hungary, and the other comprised of France and Russia. Britain, though loosely connected through alliances to France, was not as integrated into the alliance structure, though they favored the Franco-Russian alliance over the Austro-German. Colonial rivalry was also inflaming relations between countries, and in 1911, France and Germany nearly entered another war during the Agadir crisis over the control of Morocco. Ultimately, it was hyper-nationalism in the Balkans that created the spark that led to war. Situated between the receding Ottoman Empire, the struggling Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the growing Russian Empire, the Balkans were filled with various ethnic groups who had begun to press for independence. The crisis began when the reform-minded heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist in late June 1914. In the weeks that followed, it became clear that Russia intended to respond if Austria did not adequately respect Serbia's independence. In late July, this led to a week-long period in which Europe's nations declared war on each other, one after another. On the 3rd of August, Germany declared war on Russia and France and invaded neutral Belgium in an effort to quickly attack the French forces. The British, who had thus far avoided entering the war, were compelled by alliances to Belgium to declare war on Germany the following day. The conflict which followed would be fought most intensely in Europe and in particular on the Western Front in northeastern France, but theatres of it popped up all over the world. This conflict, sparked out of a poorly executed but successful assassination attempt, became known as the First World War. 2 weeks after Germany's entry into the war, Gregor joined the 1st Bavarian Foot Artillery Regiment. Over the next 4 years, he served extensively on the Western Front in northeastern France, the heart of the conflict where millions of soldiers from both alliances battled with each other in futile and disastrous frontal assaults. Strasser was present at many of the most important engagements of the war, including the Battle of Verdun in 1916 and the Battle of the Somme the same year. He was a well-respected soldier, with one commander recommending him as, quote, a complete character who fully proved himself in the field in every possible way, close quote. By the time the conflict ended, he had been awarded the Iron Cross First and Second Class, as well as the Bavarian Military Service Cross. These distinctions aside, the war lowered Strasser's perception of the imperial government, and he became increasingly convinced that Germany needed a new type of political system, which would harness its potential as a nation and would be run more efficiently than it had during the war. By the end of 1917, both sides had become exhausted and appeared ready to collapse. The Russian Empire had collapsed in a communist revolution and was embroiled in internal conflict. France and Britain's resources were stretched thin, particularly as costly battles drained both empires of its manpower. Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire were also at a crisis point from the conflict. However, it was not apparent even then that the war would end in total German defeat. However, a disaster in the shape of an American entry into the war took shape in April of 1917. The United States, which under the direction of its president, Woodrow Wilson, had long favored the Franco-Anglo alliance, sending vast amounts of munitions and supplies to sustain the conflict. The costly mistake of attempting to head off American support had backfired for the German High Command, resulting in the influx of thousands of fresh American troops. Still, military blunders and poor planning resulted in a continued stalemate as German troops maintained their lines through much of 1918. By the late autumn of 1918, the situation was looking increasingly desperate for the German army in occupied Belgium. Meanwhile, at home, the collapsing economy and wartime scarcity led to a revolution in Germany, as the navy revolted against the government. This soon led to revolts and insurrections breaking out across the country, much of it led by socialist movements in imitation of the Russian Revolution of 1917. On the 9th of November 1918, Emperor Wilhelm II abdicated, and the German Republic was quickly established. 2 days later, an armistice was signed with the British and French, and the war came to an end. Despite the end of the war, the immediate unrest continued across Germany for another year and a half, as socialist groups tried to seize control of Berlin, Munich, and other cities. In opposition, conservative organizations emerged to resist them. These political movements that shaped the remainder of Strasser's life were born out of the anarchy of the German Revolution in 1919. This was the same year that the Treaty of Versailles was signed between Germany and the victorious powers, imposing a war guilt clause on Germany, huge financial indemnities, loss of extensive territory in the east of the former empire, and a humiliating demilitarization of Western Germany and eventual occupation of the industrial lands there by France and Belgium. Strasser, like many early Nazis, despised the agreement and viewed it as a stain on the national honor of Germany. Following the war, Strasser returned to Germany and quickly completed his pharmacy studies at Erlangen University. While finishing his studies, Strasser's political activities were becoming more extreme. In the spring of 1919, he joined the Freikorps, a paramilitary organization which had been established following the war to try to suppress communist uprisings across Germany and restore order. This was necessary as the terms of the Versailles Treaty had required Germany to immediately reduce its army to 100,000 men, and the Freikorps was viewed as a way of legally circumventing this by claiming they were irregulars with no official connection to the government. Strasser despised communism and perceived the communists were denigrating the sacrifices that so many German soldiers had made during the war. He was not alone in this, and much of the fascist sentiment which swept Germany in years to come was forged out of these experiences in 1919 and 1920, in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. Ultimately, though, the Freikorps began to spiral into too large and powerful an organization, so much so that the new government of the German Weimar Republic and the heads of the Reichswehr, the small official German army, determined to reduce their numbers, and throughout 1920 and 1921 they were largely disbanded across the country. Disbanded, Strasser returned to civilian life in 1920, taking up a post as an assistant chemist in a pharmacy or chemist shop in Traunstein, where he had gone to school many years earlier. It was not long before the politically energized Gregor was involving himself in other political movements. By the end of 1920, he was a member of the Verband National Gesinnter Soldaten, a folkish movement largely comprised of army veterans, many of whom had subsequently joined the Freikorps. The VNS was effectively a political wing of the broadly disbanded Freikorps, and one which wanted to overturn the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles, while also rebuilding a strong German Reich or empire. The group and others like it were significant antecedents of the development of the Nazi Party in the early 1920s. Strasser became the organizational head of the Landshut wing of the VNS. It was in this capacity that he met and formed a close political relationship with General Erich Ludendorff, one of Germany's war heroes who had been central to German victory in the Battle of Tannenberg against Russia on the Eastern Front in the first weeks of the war. Although Strasser would soon become disillusioned with the goals of the VNS and left the organization, this was a formative period in terms of his relationships with figures like Ludendorff. These were important years as well in Strasser's personal life. For many years, he had been involved in a relationship with Else Vollmuth, a woman from Landshut, subsequently described by an acquaintance as a charming, lively and attractive woman. The end of the war and the instability which followed, as well as Gregor's time in Munich finishing his studies, delayed their plans, but on the 15th of April 1920 they were finally married. It would be a happy marriage for Gregor, for an otherwise overly direct and sometimes gruff man. For a brief time, his marriage led him to withdraw from politics, and he began building a home for the couple. Twins, named Gunther and Helmut, quickly arrived in December 1920, and with 2 more mouths to feed, Gregor decided to quit his job as a chemist shop assistant and start his own business, opening a pharmacy in Landshut. It was very successful, and unlike many of the other early members of the Nazi movement, Strasser was a comfortably middle-class businessman throughout the 1920s and financially independent, a factor which allowed him to take an independent stance on many political and party issues. While Strasser was settling into a fairly regular, middle-class life in late 1920 and into 1921, Bavaria was becoming the hub of radical, right-wing and conservative politics in Germany, as the region reacted to the emergence of the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic in April and May 1919. Many of the citizens were determined that no communist movement should be allowed to again emerge in southern Germany. These people began forming themselves into political groupings, some of which attracted the most outlandish political figures of the day. One such organization was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party in short, which emerged in February 1920 out of the German Workers' Party, a German nationalist, anti-Semitic, corporatist and folkish movement founded in January 1919. The German Workers' Party and the Nazi Party were both formed and led by Anton Drexler, but within months of establishing the Nazi Party, an upstart member by the name of Adolf Hitler, a war veteran born in Austria, had come to prominence as a public speaker within the party, and he soon used his popularity to seize control of the organization from Drexler in the summer of 1921. Over the next 2 years, it steadily grew in popularity, with Ludendorff and other prominent war figures associating with it. Its rise was also fueled by the ongoing instability of the era, with France and Belgium militarily occupying the Ruhr region of Western Germany early in 1923 in reaction to the slow payment of Germany's war debts. It remains unclear to this day exactly when Gregor Strasser joined the Nazi Party. Many years later, he claimed that he had joined as early as 1920 and was a branch leader of the party in Landshut by the spring of 1921. His brother Otto, writing decades later, muddied the waters further by stating that Gregor had met with Hitler and Ludendorff privately in the first half of 1920 and became a member of the party at that stage. But this latter account is almost certainly spurious, as Hitler was not even a member of the party at that point, and Ludendorff was not really associated with it for some time to come. Unfortunately, Gregor's membership number, which would allow us to date his time of membership with some precision, has also not survived. The reality, Otto's fantasies and Gregor's self-mythologizing aside, it seems to have been that while he had a loose association with the party for some time before becoming a member, Gregor did not officially join the Nazis until sometime in the autumn of 1922. He joined the Sturmabteilung, or SA, as well around this time, this being the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, members of which wore distinctive brown shirts. Despite his assertions that he founded the Landshut wing of the SA, this was already in existence for some time before Strasser became a Nazi member, though he did quickly emerge as a prominent figure within it, and by March 1923, he was appointed as the SA leader of the new Lower Bavarian Regiment. The rising popularity of the Nazis and the growth of the SA all took place during a deteriorating political situation in Germany, the most unstable year in the country's politics and society since 1919, as the Franco-Belgian occupation of the Ruhr aroused indignation across large sections of German society and inflation spiraled. It was in this environment that Hitler and other leading members of the Nazis decided to attempt a coup in Bavaria, the goal being to seize power in Munich and then descend on Berlin and take over the country in a manner which would mimic what Benito Mussolini and his Italian fascists had done in their successful march on Rome in October 1922. The abortive Nazi coup has become known as the Beer Hall Putsch, as it began at the Burger Bräukeller Beer Hall in Munich on the night of the 8th of November 1923. It was initially successful, as over 2,000 Nazis and SA men seized the beer hall and the surrounding region, as well as detained several prominent Munich political figures. But the momentum soon faded through inaction, and early in the morning of the 9th, the rebels decided to march on the center of the city. There they were met with an armed police unit that opened fire and killed 16 Nazis. The putsch collapsed and Hitler fled from Munich, despite the Nazis and SA still outnumbering the police detachments. Overall, the Beer Hall Putsch was a shambolic affair, badly planned and abandoned at the first signs of difficulty. Strasser played a minor role in the events of the 8th and 9th of November. As early as the 23rd of October, he attended a meeting of senior SA figures in Munich, chaired by Hermann Göring, one which engaged with the topic of an armed putsch, but at which details of what was planned by the upper brass of the party were not fully revealed. On the 7th of November, he was told to have the detachments under his command prepared to attend a rally Hitler would speak at, orders which were soon expanded into telling him to lead his division of SA men to Munich. By this time, he knew something serious was about to happen, but the precise details of the plot remained a closely guarded secret amongst Hitler and his confidants. Strasser was not involved in the events of the evening and night of the 8th of November at the beer hall itself, but when Strasser's unit of SA arrived in the district in the early hours of the 9th of November, he was ordered to secure a bridge over the river Isar near the beer hall. He duly did so, but his role in affairs ended later that day when news arrived of the fiasco in the city centre and the end of the putsch. Thereafter, in something of a pathetic scene for an attempted coup, Strasser led his division to the train station, singing patriotic songs, where they boarded the evening train back to Landshut. Despite his limited role in the beer hall putsch, Strasser decided he needed to disappear from Bavaria for a time in its aftermath. Despite the chaotic manner in which it had been attempted, the regional government was concerned enough by the events of the evening of the 8th of November and the morning of the 9th that it moved to suppress the Nazi Party and arrest and prosecute many of its senior members. As a regional leader in Landshut, Strasser was a person of interest, and so he absconded to northern Germany, even as figures like Hitler and Ludendorff were being arrested in southern Germany in the weeks that followed. Ludendorff was largely pardoned on account of his status as a war hero, but Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he would only serve 8 months in the end, and the time away provided the opportunity for him to produce much of his lengthy, paranoid and rambling political manifesto, Mein Kampf. The Nazi Party was also prohibited across Bavaria, and many of its members, Strasser included, quickly joined other right-wing, hard-line nationalist groups in southern Germany, which effectively became fronts for unofficial membership of the Nazi Party. Gregor was eventually arrested and placed on trial in the spring of 1924 for his role in the beer hall putsch. He was prosecuted as part of a mass trial of Nazis who had played minor roles in the insurrection and was found guilty on the 12th of May of aiding and abetting treasonous activity. He was given a 15-month sentence at Landsberg prison, where Hitler had also been sent. Unlike his party leader, Strasser would only serve a few weeks of his sentence. This was owing to his election to the Bavarian Regional Parliament, the Landtag, late that spring, having put himself forward as a candidate for the Völkischer Sozialer Block, or VSB, a political party which had emerged in the aftermath of the putsch from a union of the Bavarian National Socialists and other folkish groups. Strasser, who had been involved in the formation talks, benefited greatly from this, as his election to the Landtag conferred political immunity on him and resulted in his release from Landsberg later that summer. He returned to a Germany where the National Reichstag elections of May 1924 had seen a shift towards more moderate centrist politics following the end of the occupation of the Ruhr and the beginning of a period of considerable economic revival in Germany. With this, it became clear to many senior Nazis that they could not hope to seize power through a future coup, but would have to enter electoral politics and try to gain influence in this way. Hitler was released from prison in December 1924, against the advice of many figures within Bavarian politics and the courts. Within 8 weeks, he had convinced the regional government to lift the ban on the Nazi Party, which had been imposed after the putsch. Strasser was quickly elected as the Gauleiter, or regional leader of the part of Lower Bavaria. He would hold this position for the next 4 years, and so was a major figure within Nazism from early 1925 on, following its reconstitution. Much of his role, as for the other Gauleiters and heads of the party during this period, was to try to reassemble it to what it had been in 1923 before the putsch, with many members having gone on to other pursuits in the intervening period. There were many moving parts in this, not least the management of Nazi publications and propaganda wings. Additionally, the work Strasser had to contend with doubled in 1926 when the Upper Palatinate region of Germany was added to his regional command. To take some of the burden off him, Heinrich Himmler, an emerging member of the party, was employed as his assistant. Gregor played a major role in the organization of the party and its activities throughout the second half of the 1920s. While the ban on the Nazi Party had been lifted, Hitler was still prohibited from speaking at public events for some time, and so it fell to the Gauleiters and other senior figures to give speeches across different parts of Germany, trying to drum up support for a minor party. Gregor was not the most gifted of orators, but his argumentation was persuasive, and he gained a lot of followers through his public appearances, along with his efficient administration of the party in the regions he was Gauleiter of. Some of this was facilitated by the work of Joseph Goebbels, an aspiring writer who had joined the party and become a propagandist for it, in the northern and western divisions under Strasser's direction. As a result, the party became 3 times larger in the area under his leadership by 1926 than it had been prior to the beer hall putsch in 1923. In the course of 1925 and into 1926, Strasser, and to an extent his brother Otto, emerged as the leaders of a wing of the party which became a direct competitor of the centralized branches of it in the south of Bavaria in Munich and its hinterland. Much of this centered on Strasser's vitriolic attacks on the Weimar Republic, and in particular the Dawes Plan, an American-brokered initiative which reduced the burden of the war reparations payments which Germany had to pay and set the country up for an economic recovery from 1924 onwards, along with the economic system which pertained in Germany. While much of what Strasser was saying during this period aligned with mainstream Nazi policies, in terms of being extremely anti-Semitic, racial, and ultra-nationalist, some of it conflicted strongly with the mainstream party line in Munich. Owing to all of this, by the end of 1925, there was quite a rift developing between the northern wing of the party under Strasser's influence and the southern wing of the party, centered on Hitler and his closest associates in Munich. A showdown was brewing. One might ask at this juncture what Strasserism, as it has become known after Gregor and Otto's ideas, was and how it differed from the version of Nazism which emerged fully in the 1930s. What, in effect, were the various wings of the Nazi Party arguing over in the 1920s? Strasserism was more left-leaning than the Munich branch of Nazism. For instance, a person today might be confused as to why the Nazis espoused a political ideology which they termed National Socialism, even though ideologically they were vehemently opposed to communism, the most radical branch of socialism. Strasser was a huge influence on this concept of National Socialism, arguing for a form of socialism which was about the collective need of people in society, ergo socialism, to lead the national rejuvenation of Germany. He explained this quite clearly in a speech which he gave in the early 1920s, stating, "Because we had become nationalists in the trenches, we could not help becoming socialists in the trenches. We could not help coming home with the brutal intention of gathering the whole nation round us and teaching them that the greatness of a nation depends on the willingness of the individual to stand up for his nation." But Strasserism also was socialist in the sense that it leaned more to the left economically than the version of Nazism which became dominant in the 1930s. This was because Gregor and like-minded Nazis were rabidly opposed to the business classes of Germany and the capitalist system, perceiving them as having been largely responsible, along with the Jewish community of Germany, for the nation's defeat in the war and the acceptance of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. As such, they wanted a more left-leaning form of socialism, where the state would play a greater role in the economic sphere. In this regard, they were quite ideologically aligned with the communists in many ways, but where they were bitterly opposed was in their racial ideologies. Strasserites believed firmly in the superiority of the German people and wanted a national revival, whereas communism, which the vast majority of early Nazis held to be part of a vast Jewish conspiracy, was international in its theoretical ideas and rejected racial hierarchies in favor of economic ones, which prioritized the well-being of the international proletariat, or working classes. The clash between Strasserites and the Munich branch of the Nazi Party came to a head in the spring of 1926, when Hitler convened a conference in Bamberg to resolve the developing divide between the northern wing and the Munich wing of the party. This was in response to Strasser's convening of a separate meeting of northern leaders in Westphalia the previous September, and the very real possibility of the party splintering into two organizations. This became a greater possibility since Strasser was beginning to question the wisdom of the policy of using electoral politics to acquire power in Germany, given that the economic recovery of the 1920s was pushing voters back towards more moderate centrist parties rather than favoring groups like the Nazis. By the end of 1925, Strasser was after drawing up his own policy program, which contained many points which conflicted with Hitler's views on Germany going forward, notably over the foreign policy which Germany would follow under Nazi rule, and also the specifics of Lebensraum, the living space which the Nazis aimed to create for Germans by conquering much of Europe, particularly in the east into Poland and the Soviet Union. The conference at Bamberg was something of a last-ditch effort to prevent a major split in the party between Hitler and Strasser's wings, although the word conference does not accurately describe it. At it, Hitler showed up and basically informed the 60 or so delegates that there would be no further dissent within the party, and the concept of the Führerprinzip was immutable. This concept was that the leader of the party had the final say on all matters of party policy. Strasser might have tried at this stage to break away from the main party, but in the end he effectively surrendered, agreeing to accept Hitler's views henceforth and promising to try to have any copies of his draft manifestos produced and distributed weeks earlier collected and destroyed. This effectively ended the potential schism, though for months thereafter Strasser and his allies remained something of a threat, one which Hitler continued to try to undermine by courting figures like Goebbels and drawing them away from their alliance with Strasser. By 1927, the split had largely healed. Fresh federal elections were held in Germany in the early summer of 1928. These were the first Reichstag elections since December 1924 and would provide a good insight into how the party was faring countrywide since its re-establishment in 1925. Strasser's rehabilitation after the split in 1925 and 1926 was evident in his appointment to effectively oversee the propaganda campaign during the elections, in association with Goebbels. Nevertheless, the results were not promising for the party. They received just over 800,000 votes, equating to not much over 2.5% of the vote nationally. Much of this was geographically isolated to Bavaria. In certain parts of the country, notably the far north and northeast, they barely made any impression, as well as in Berlin, where they won just 1.4%. By way of contrast, their ideological enemies, the Communist Party of Germany, obtained 3.2 million votes and over 10% of the national vote percentage. This poor showing for the Nazis left them with only 12 members elected to the 491-seat Reichstag. Strasser was among them, gaining election for the Franconia district, while Goebbels and Göring were also elected, as was Wilhelm Frick, an ally of Strasser's. From an electoral perspective, this was a beginning of sorts for the Nazis on the national stage, but it must surely have seemed like an uphill struggle for members at this juncture if they were to seize complete control of Germany. But things were about to change dramatically just over a year later. Up until the late 1920s, the Nazis had ultimately remained a fringe movement within Germany, with individuals like Strasser being rare exceptions within it as figures who won election to the Reichstag. But despite this success and that of a few others, the Nazis were most certainly a fringe political party as the end of the decade loomed. All of that changed radically owing to the events of the autumn of 1929. It was at this juncture that the stock markets on Wall Street in New York City crashed spectacularly over the space of a few weeks, peaking between the 24th and 29th of October, 2 days known henceforth as Black Thursday and Black Tuesday. This came off the back of years of speculative investments across the Western world during a period of immense economic growth following the tumultuous years of the First World War and the revolutions which followed it. The Great Depression, a period of sustained economic decline, mass unemployment and political crisis, followed over the next half of a decade. Germany was hit particularly hard, and as it was, people began turning to the Nazis, with their message of national revival and scapegoating of Germany's problems on minorities and foreign countries as a viable party of government. The Nazis' growing popularity was evident already in 1930, as waves of disaffected people, unemployed, their life savings eviscerated owing to skyrocketing inflation, and their economic futures devastated, returned to the extremist political views of the early 1920s, which had abated briefly between 1924 and 1929. Hitler drew enormous crowds as he toured the country speaking in halls, and the party adopted a strategy of continuous campaigning, even when elections weren't looming. All of this soon translated into electoral success when an election was called. In the Reichstag elections of September 1930, 6.3 million Germans voted for the Nazis, representing an increase from approximately 2.5% of the vote in 1928 to over 18% 2 years later, a result which catapulted them from being the ninth party in the country to the second largest. Membership of the party also increased over time, with over 500,000 members by the late spring of 1931. There was also a dramatic growth in the other wings of the party. By 1932, the SA had 400,000 members, while Heinrich Himmler's SS, a rising paramilitary group, originally established as a private bodyguard for Hitler, had over 10,000 members by that time. Strasser played a role that was absolutely central to the expansion of the party during these years. In 1928, the command structure of the Nazis had changed, with Strasser being given overall control of the party's organizational structure and administration countrywide, while Goebbels was selected to replace him as the chief propagandist for the Nazis. This was a promotion for Strasser and made him one of the most powerful figures in the party yet again, a seemingly strange decision so soon after the split of 1925 and 1926. While Strasser and Strasserism continued to be viewed as something of a threat to Hitler's authority in Munich, no one was in any doubt as to Gregor's ability as an organizer. It was for this reason that he was placed in charge of the organization of the party in 1928, a position he would hold down to the end of 1932, during the critical years of growth which would eventually bring the Nazis to power. Many of the reasons for his success in this role point towards his practicality as an administrator and his attention to detail, skills which were entirely lacking in many of the other senior members of the party during these years. For instance, after the 1928 election, Strasser began preparing for the next elections, whenever they might be held, by reorganizing the party cells and divisions so that they mirrored those of the Reichstag electoral districts. In this way, potential candidates for the next election could focus exclusively on the regions that they would stand for election in, when next Germans went to the polls nationally. Despite his promotion, there remained divisions between Strasser and Hitler in the late 1920s and into the early 1930s. Their divisions continued to focus on many of the issues which had arisen years earlier, notably the Strasserite emphasis on left-leaning economic policies and more ardent rejection of capitalism than the mainstream of the party. In 1930, this difference of views became more public when Gregor and his brother Otto set up the Nationaler Sozialist, a Berlin-based newspaper which sought to promote their version of National Socialism. This conflicted directly with Joseph Goebbels' Berlin newspaper Der Angriff, The Attack, and the clash of ideas led to a collapse of Strasser and Goebbels' relationship. The latter asked Hitler to intervene, which he did, once again making it clear to Strasser that he needed to toe the party line. These events were sufficient for Otto Strasser, who had always leaned even further to the left than Gregor, to leave Germany altogether, fearing for his safety. He headed to Austria, where he would subsequently establish the Black Front as a scion of Nazism in opposition to Hitler. Gregor remained in Germany and in his position within the party, but as Hitler's grip on it became more absolute, his position was becoming tenuous. Perhaps one of the reasons why Strasser was retained in his position, despite his repeated transgressions, was simply because of how effective he was, as evinced in 1932. There were 2 Reichstag elections held in quick succession that year. The first came in July 1932, after nearly 2 years of a minority government, which had become increasingly unpopular as the economic crisis deepened and showed no signs of easing in Germany. In it, the Nazis experienced a surge in support, becoming the largest party in the country with 37% of the vote, a result that translated into 230 seats in the 608-seat Reichstag. Yet this result did not lead to the formation of any kind of stable government, as none of the main parties, the Nazis, the Social Democrats, the Communists, and the Centre Party, were viable partners. As a consequence, fresh elections were held just over 3 months later, in early November, but this too failed to break the deadlock. Curiously, the Nazi vote fell by 4% on this occasion, but they remained the largest party in the country by a considerable margin. What troubled some centre and centre-right political figures with this second election result was that the Communist Party had increased their vote yet again from 14% to nearly 17% in the space of 3 months, between the July elections and the November elections. In such a politically tumultuous environment, many feared that they would find the popularity they had obtained back in 1919 and might surge to power before long if a stable government of some kind was not formed. Under these circumstances, negotiations between the political establishment that had run the Weimar Republic for much of the last decade and the Nazis were entered into in a concerted fashion late in 1932. Unexpectedly, these events quickly led to the end of Strasser's political career. The elections of November 1932 had clearly left the Nazis as the largest and most powerful party in the country. Despite this, the other major political parties and their leaders, as well as technocratic politicians such as the serving Chancellor of the country, Franz von Papen, and most especially the President, Paul von Hindenburg, were determined that the Nazis would not be allowed to lead a government and that Hitler should not become the Chancellor or Prime Minister of the country. To this end, negotiations focused throughout the early winter of 1932 on whether the Nazis would help form a government that would have a majority in the Reichstag on the basis of Hitler being given the more junior post of Vice-Chancellor or Deputy Prime Minister, and the Nazis being given several senior ministerial briefs. These terms were unacceptable to Hitler, who was determined that he would play hardball and only accept the office of Chancellor. Strasser was opposed to this approach and argued that the slight drop in support of the party between the July and November elections demonstrated that they could not acquire a majority in Parliament if another election were held. With this in mind, he entered into clandestine negotiations with Kurt von Schleicher concerning possible terms for the Nazis entering into government. Schleicher was a military figure who had served as a Minister for Defense and whom Hindenburg appointed as an interim Chancellor on the 3rd of December until the political impasse was resolved. Von Schleicher may have hoped to split the Nazi Party by reigniting the Strasser-Hitler divide and possibly acquiring an alliance with the Strasserite wing. This never transpired. Strasser's negotiations were discovered within days, and a meeting of the Nazi Reichstag members was convened, whereat the 30 or so members who supported Strasser were forced into denouncing him. On the 8th of December, he was forced to resign his positions within the party and effectively retire from political life. 6 weeks later, Hitler publicly denounced the former party manager, and in March 1934, Strasser resigned his seat in the Reichstag. His political career and his time with the Nazis was over. Within weeks, the Nazis were in government and began to tighten their grip on power. In the course of January 1933, negotiations were held in private between conservative and centre-right political figures such as the former Chancellor von Papen and leading German industrialists and business people who were determined that a new government should be formed with Hitler and the Nazis to stabilize the economic situation. Out of these, an agreement was reached to form a coalition government headed by Hitler. He was appointed as Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January 1933. Within weeks, the Nazis consolidated their grip on power, using a fire at the Reichstag blamed on communist elements, which the Nazis may or may not have orchestrated, to declare a national emergency, arrest thousands of their political enemies, and pass an enabling act, which effectively allowed Hitler and his allies to rule by decree. The Reichstag was maintained as an institution, one which rubber-stamped legislation which was sent to it, but effectively the Weimar Republic came to an end in the spring of 1933, and Germany was henceforth ruled as a one-party state, with Hitler as its absolute ruler, merging the offices of Chancellor and President to become Führer or leader in 1934 following the death of President Hindenburg. The events of the end of 1932 led to Strasser withdrawing entirely from political life. Aware perhaps of the danger he might be in if he tried to continue in German politics as the Nazis were taking control of the country, he determined to become a private citizen and to return to his prior calling as a pharmacist. This would not be by returning to his native Bavaria, where he had already sold his chemist business for a handsome profit back in the 1920s. Instead, with the permission of Hitler and the Nazi upper brass, he took up a job with Schering Kalbaum, the Berlin subsidiary of IG Farben, a massive German chemical and pharmaceutical conglomerate which had been formed by the amalgamation of pre-existing German pharmaceutical and chemical companies, like Bayer and Agfa in 1925. IG Farben had been previously derided by the Nazis as a front for Jewish dominance of parts of the German business world in the 1920s, but the company would later become intensely allied with the Nazi regime, and during the war, Camp 3 at Auschwitz. Auschwitz-Monowitz became a slave labor camp run by IG Farben to primarily produce artificial rubber for the German wartime economy. Yet in 1933, when he joined the Berlin subsidiary, IG Farben had not been overtly politicized, and Strasser appears to have abandoned all political activities when he took up his position there, going so far as to sunder relationships with some former political friends. All the same, the Nazi Party was keeping watch on his behavior throughout 1933 and into 1934. Luckily for Strasser, Hermann Göring's suggestion, given shortly after the Nazis seized power, that Strasser should be eliminated as a political threat was not heeded. In the year that followed the Nazis' monopolization of power, with the passage of the Enabling Act in the spring of 1933, Hitler moved to solidify and strengthen his position as leader of the Nazis and of the country at large. This effort faced some considerable challenges. One came from the military. A core goal of the Nazis was to begin rearming, in violation of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, as quickly as possible, in preparation for a new war, which would restore Germany's position as a great power and ultimately lead to mastery of Europe. But as much as he aimed to do so, the military commanders of the German army, for the most part, were not members of the Nazi Party. It would take half a decade before Hitler was able to root out opponents within the army and replace them with commanders more loyal to him. However, the greater threat in 1933 and 1934 came from the SA and elements within the party who were still committed to a more Strasserite form of Nazism. These viewed Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA, whose numbers surpassed 3 million members early in 1934, as a potential figure to challenge Hitler. Strasser himself, though, remained aloof from any of these machinations, though he would soon be dragged into them and it would end his life. Hitler and his closest allies in the government, notably Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and Strasser's erstwhile former ally, Joseph Goebbels, began plotting a move against Röhm and the SA in the spring of 1934. In an initiative which would be led by the SS, which Himmler intended to supersede the SA as the foremost paramilitary group of Nazism, the plan was to strike against Röhm and the heads of the SA, as well as a range of other political enemies on the 30th of June 1934. The incident would become known as the Night of the Long Knives, though it actually began early in the day and would eventually consist of 3 days of violence across the country. Röhm was imprisoned in Munich on the 30th of June and executed the following day. There are varying estimates as to the death toll, but hundreds of targets were killed, and the number could have been as high as 1,000. This purged the party of opponents of Hitler, and in the aftermath of it, the SA's influence was reduced and the SS began to emerge as a major paramilitary organization. Gregor Strasser was one of those who were murdered as part of the purges that occurred during the Night of the Long Knives. As we have seen, the party higher-ups had remained wary of him, and Göring had proposed murdering him in 1933. Now the wider purge of the SA and party was to include Strasser. Just after midday on the 30th of June, after having lunch at home, 5 members of the Gestapo, the secret police of the state of Prussia, which was to become notorious all over Nazi Europe in years to come, arrived to the door of Strasser's apartment in Berlin. They informed him that they needed to search his office at Schöring-Kalbam. Strasser assured his wife Elsa that everything would be fine and left with them. They never saw each other again. Instead, when Strasser arrived to his office, he found a number of SS officers there who detained him and took him to the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin on Prince Albrecht Strasse. There he was told he would be questioned, but instead an SS captain entered his holding cell shortly afterwards and shot him several times. Gregor's body was cremated shortly afterwards, and a week later his wife, who had no idea what had happened to him in the intervening period, had an urn with his ashes delivered to their apartment. A week after that, Hitler briefly noted in an address to the Reichstag that Strasser had been involved in a conspiracy against the state with Röhm and others, a claim which no evidence has ever been found for. We might ask why Strasser was really killed in 1934. After all, he had accepted his political defeat at the end of 1932 and had retired to become a private citizen. There is no evidence to suggest that he was involved in any conspiracies against Hitler or the Nazis after he left politics, and in retrospect he did not pose a threat to the party in power. But suspicions lingered in Berlin. In particular, some feared that Gregor might be in contact with his brother Otto, who in exile in Austria had established the Black Front as a reactionary form of Nazism that sought to undermine the German party from abroad. At a time when the Nazis were already seeking to establish control over Austria, anyone associated with the Black Front was viewed with suspicion. There is no evidence to suggest that Gregor was allied with his brother in this, but the suspicion was probably enough for him to lose his life. Added to this was the very nature of the Night of the Long Knives, as an effort to settle old scores. Amongst the dead, for instance, was Gustav Ritter von Kahr, a Bavarian judge who had been giving a speech in the Bürgerbräukeller on the 8th of November 1923 when the beer hall putsch was launched, and had subsequently testified at the Nazi trials in 1924. 9 years later, the Nazis exacted revenge. In such a context, Strasser could not hope to avoid becoming a target, and in retrospect, the major question is why he didn't flee from Germany like his brother before Hitler and his allies came after him. The Nazis became ever more radical in government after Strasser's death and the Night of the Long Knives. With this, Hitler's grip on the party was assured, and the continued elevation of extreme ideologues like Joseph Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler too, with Himmler's SS, a much more dangerous paramilitary organization than the SA, emerging as a major force in German life, one which would administer the concentration camp system across Europe during the Second World War. Meanwhile, the farthest left wing of the Nazi Party largely vanished, with its leaders either dead or in exile, while others were pacified through the corporatist economic policies pursued in the 1930s, as widespread employment of German people through infrastructure projects such as the construction of the autobahns, as well as the enlisting of hundreds of thousands of men into the army as Germany remilitarized, did much to tackle the employment and economic problems, which had been one of the major focuses of the Strasserite wing of the party. Otto continued to live abroad, running the Black Front, gradually migrating from Austria to Czechoslovakia to France and then to Canada as the Nazis conquered each of the countries he had moved to in turn between 1938 and 1940. He spent much of the war as a vocal critic of the Nazis, appealing without much success to Germans to resist the regime. After the war, he was eventually allowed to return to his native Bavaria in 1955, where he spent the remaining 19 years of his life advocating for a rehabilitated form of Nazism in the context of the Cold War. Gregor Strasser represented a different wing of the Nazi Party in the 1920s and early 1930s. Like the form of Nazism which became dominant under Hitler in power in the 1930s, it was ultra-nationalist, fascist, anti-Semitic and inherently racial in its ideological framework, but it was more left-wing, with an emphasis on the social aspect of National Socialism, calling for a more wide-ranging attack on capitalism and a democratization of economic activity in Germany. Whereas in forging an alliance with the business and financial establishment of Germany in January 1933, Hitler effectively geared the Nazis towards a corporatist form of capitalism in alliance with right-wing business and political groups. Consequently, if Gregor and his brother Otto and their allies had won out in the ideological conflict within the party in the 1920s and early 1930s, there might have been a slightly different form of Nazism that developed once they claimed power in Germany. But what that would have meant in terms of the racial policies of the Nazis, the approach towards the Jewish people, and the manner in which Germany pulled Europe into the most violent conflict in human history in the late 1930s, is all speculative. It would surely have been different in some ways, but in what ways is open to considerable debate. Yet this should not detract from the fact that Gregor Strasser was an ideological Nazi and was instrumental in the party's rise to power. The fact that he ultimately fell foul of Hitler and was murdered during the Night of the Long Knives should not earn him a reprieve in the judgment of history. What do you think of Gregor Strasser? Could a very different form of Nazism have developed in Germany if the Strasserite wing of the party had won out over the Munich wing in the 1920s, or would Strasser have merely continued to support Hitler despite ideological disagreements? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.